My son Noah's 10th birthday was supposed to be the night he felt like the most important person in the world. I had spent 3 months planning every detail, coordinating with the city's most exclusive seafood lounge, securing a private RAM that usually required 6 months of advance notice and connections I had spent years cultivating through my corporate event planning business. The reservation alone cost more than most people's monthly rent, but this was Noah's 10th birthday, a milestone that deserved to be celebrated with all the pomp and circumstance my successful career could provide. I had arranged for a specialized baker to create a cake shaped like Noah's favorite video game character, complete with edible gold leaf details that caught the light like tiny captured stars. The guest list was carefully curated to include only Noah's closest friends from school and our dearest family friends, who had watched him grow from a colicky infant into the kind, thoughtful boy he had become. This was going to be his night, his moment to feel celebrated, cherished, and deeply loved. Instead, it became the night I watched my sister-in-law Heather look me straight in the eye across a table meant for my son's celebration, and treat me with such calculated cruelty that something fundamental inside me finally snapped. The private room I had reserved overflowed with imported crystal glasses that caught the chandelier light like scattered diamonds, vintage champagne chilling in silver buckets that cost more than my first car, and the empty, practiced smiles of 6 women I had never met before that night and would never forget for the rest of my life. These were Heather's uninvited influencer friends, each one carefully selected for their follower counts and their willingness to document every moment of their supposedly glamorous lives for strangers on the internet. They had arrived before us, somehow managing to talk their way into the private room I had reserved months ago, settling into the seats meant for Noah's grandparents and his best friend from school. The table meant to seat 12 now overflowed with 14 people, and my son stood in the doorway holding his small, carefully chosen birthday cake, searching the crowded room for a place to sit. Heather did not even glance in his direction. She was too busy arranging the perfect angle for a photograph, tilting her champagne glass just so, ensuring the restaurant's name was visible in the background of every shot. My mother-in-law, Elizabeth, sat at the far end of the table, her face frozen in an expression I had seen 1,000 times before, the look of a woman who had learned to survive her daughter's chaos by becoming very, very still. Heather's husband, Kevin, occupied the seat nearest the door, his eyes fixed on the polished wood of the table in front of him, the posture of a man who had long ago surrendered to the hurricane he married. The moment Noah stepped fully into the room, still clutching his cake, his face a mixture of confusion and rising disappointment, Heather finally acknowledged our presence. She stood up from the center chair, the chair I had specifically requested be reserved for the birthday boy, and with one fluid motion of her manicured hand, she dismissed my child from his own celebration. She shoved him aside with her hip as she reached for another glass of champagne, not hard enough to knock him down, but with enough casual indifference to make it clear that his presence was an inconvenience. My husband Matthew stepped forward, his jaw tightening in that way I had learned to recognize as the precursor to a confrontation he would later regret, but I placed my hand on his arm. This was not the moment. Not yet. Heather turned to face me, her smile never reaching those cold, calculating eyes, and the words that came out of her mouth next would replay in my mind for months afterward. She locked eyes with me across that reserved table, surrounded by her rented friends and their recording phones, and she spoke with the casual authority of someone who had never been told no. She told me to take that cheap cake out of her background because it was ruining her aesthetic. She told me to tell the waiter to bring more chairs for the people I had somehow failed to anticipate. Then she paused for dramatic effect, making sure her influencer friends were still recording, and delivered the line that would ultimately cost her everything. She told me to put my card down for this table and consider it my rent for being in this family. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the waiters hovering near the doorway seemed to hold their breath. I swallowed the hard lump forming in my throat, the one that felt like a stone I had been carrying for the better part of a decade. Under the heavy mahogany table, I squeezed my fists until my knuckles turned white, focusing on the physical sensation of my fingernails pressing into my palms as a way to anchor myself against the tidal wave of fury rising in my chest. Heather watched me with that familiar expression of expectant entitlement, the look that said she already knew how this would end, because it had ended this way 100 times before. She was counting on my silence. She was counting on my desperate need to avoid a scene, my pathological commitment to keeping the peace in a family that had never once extended me the same courtesy. She was counting on the fact that for 10 years, I had been the one to swallow my pride, open my wallet, and pretend that being treated like a doormat was simply the price of admission for loving her brother. But what Heather did not understand, what she could not possibly have anticipated, because she had never once stopped to consider who I actually was beneath all that enforced accommodation, was that she had finally crossed a line I could not uncross. My son stood beside me, still holding that stupid cake, his eyes searching my face for an explanation I did not have the words to provide. His disappointment was a physical weight pressing against my chest, and something inside me shifted. Something that had been bending and bending under the weight of years of small humiliations finally snapped clean through. I looked at my sister-in-law, really looked at her, stripped of all the family obligation that usually softened my perception, and what I saw was not family at all. What I saw was a parasite that had been feeding on my kindness for a decade, growing bolder with every meal I provided. I took my son's hand in mine, feeling his small fingers curl instinctively around my own. I looked at Heather one final time, my expression carefully neutral, my voice steady as I wished her a lovely meal. Then I turned and walked out those heavy oak doors, pulling my phone from my pocket to begin initiating what would become her absolute financial ruin. I coordinate elite corporate events for a living. When a chief executive officer's private helicopter gets grounded an hour before a massive product launch, when a keynote speaker comes down with food poisoning 20 minutes before they are meant to take the stage, when a venue double books and threatens to derail a conference 6 months in the planning, I am the person they call. I manage high-stakes crises for the top 1% every single day. I negotiate with vendors who think their services are irreplaceable. I execute contingency plans that would make military strategists nod in approval. I never break a sweat. I never raise my voice. I simply assess the situation, identify the leverage points, and proceed with the calm efficiency of someone who understands that emotional reactions are luxuries I cannot afford. But the most relentless crisis I have ever had to manage was not a demanding client or a logistics nightmare. It was my 43-year-old sister-in-law, Heather, the family's untouchable golden child, who had never been held accountable for a single thing in her entire privileged, entitled, monumentally destructive life. To understand why I did what I did that night, you need to understand who Heather really was beneath all that carefully curated social media perfection. Heather was the kind of woman who strutted around dripping in fresh-off-the-runway designer clothing, acting like she owned every room she entered, posting daily content that painted her life as an endless parade of luxury travel, exclusive parties, and the effortless glamour that supposedly came with being an influencer in the modern economy. Her Instagram feed was a masterpiece of manufactured perfection, every image professionally edited, every caption carefully crafted to project the image of a woman living her absolute best life. She had tens of thousands of followers who believed every word she typed, who left envious comments on her posts, and dreamed of achieving even a fraction of her apparent success. But peel back those designer labels and that facade of internet fame, and Heather was absolutely drowning. Her entire manufactured life was funded by a precarious house of cards built on maxed-out credit cards, secret payday loans with interest rates that would make a loan shark blush, and my husband Matthew's endless exhausted guilt. She had been bleeding us dry for years, and every time we tried to set boundaries, every time we tried to say enough was enough, the family would close ranks around her and treat us like villains for refusing to enable her destructive behavior any longer. The year before Noah's disastrous birthday party, Heather had stolen $2,000 straight from our family vacation fund. We had been saving for 8 months to take Noah to see the ocean for the first time, putting aside a little money from each paycheck into a separate account that was supposed to be untouchable. Matthew had given Heather access to our accounts years ago when she was going through a rough patch, needing help managing her finances while her husband was between jobs. He had never revoked that access, another in a long line of mistakes we would eventually pay for. Heather had called him at 2 a.m, sobbing so hard she could barely speak, claiming that she needed emergency funds to save her house from imminent foreclosure. She swore on her children's lives, on her mother's grave, on every sacred thing she could think of, that this was a true life-or-death situation, and she would pay us back within the month when some mythical insurance settlement came through. Matthew, exhausted and desperate to help his sister, had gone back to sleep believing he had done the right thing. 2 days later, my social media feed was flooded with pictures of Heather sipping mimosas at a 5-star luxury spa 2 towns over, her captions gushing about treating herself to some much-needed self-care. The same woman who had been facing foreclosure 48 hours earlier was now wrapped in a plush white robe, getting hot stone massages and drinking champagne that cost more per glass than most people spend on a week's worth of groceries. When I confronted Matthew about it, he was devastated but ultimately unwilling to confront his sister. When I took my concerns to his parents, Elizabeth and her husband Richard, I was met with the same response I had received 100 times before. They told me to drop it. They told me that family always bails out family. They told me that Heather was going through a hard time and needed our support, not our judgment. They dismissed my anger as overreaction. They laughed at my boundaries, treating my attempts to protect our financial security like they were the irrational demands of a woman who simply did not understand what family meant. They had no idea that their laughter was sealing their daughter's absolute financial doom. They had no idea that every dismissal, every accusation of selfishness, every demand that I sacrifice my family's well-being for their golden child's comfort was building a case against Heather that would eventually destroy everything she had spent years pretending to be. Heather did not crash Noah's birthday party just to be cruel, although cruelty certainly came naturally to her by that point. She was suffocating under the weight of her own lies, drowning in debt she could no longer service, and desperate to maintain the illusion of success that her entire identity had come to depend on. She had made a reckless, desperate promise to those 6 influencer friends who were not actually her friends at all. She had promised to host them at this ultra-exclusive seafood lounge in exchange for them tagging her in their posts and inviting her on a sponsored brand trip to Cabo San Lucas that she believed would finally provide her with the career breakthrough she had been chasing for years. Her bank accounts were frozen. Her husband's cards were declined everywhere in town. The credit card companies were calling multiple times a day. The payday loan sharks had started showing up at her door. Hijacking my pristine corporate reservation was her very last frantic gamble to keep her fake rich persona breathing for one more night. She banked on my silence. She assumed I would simply pull out my company card and swallow the bill like I always did to keep the peace. She assumed I was a doormat, but she had forgotten something crucial about doormats. Even the most passive ones eventually get walked on enough times that they start to bite back. While Matthew, Noah, and I retreated to the lobby to figure out our next steps, back in the main dining room, Heather was putting on the performance of a lifetime. The waiter had not even finished pouring the water before she started barking orders with the entitled certainty of someone who had never once considered that her instructions might be questioned. She announced that they would take 2 of the grand plateaus, waving her hand dismissively in the direction of the menu, without even glancing at the prices. These were the restaurant's most expensive offerings, massive seafood towers featuring the Maine lobster, imported caviar, fresh oysters harvested that morning from exclusive beds along the coast, and enough delicacies to feed a small army. She demanded 3 bottles of their best vintage champagne and instructed the staff to keep them coming throughout the evening. Then she leaned across the table, making absolutely certain that her fake influencer friends were recording her on their phones, and delivered her prepared speech with the practiced ease of someone who had performed this exact scene many times before. She told them not to hold back, to order whatever they wanted, because her sister-in-law was picking up the tab. She made sure to mention that I just planned little parties for a living, emphasizing the dismissive tone to make it clear that my career was somehow less legitimate than her parasitic existence as an influencer. She said that I loved to treat them, painting herself as the generous host while positioning me as the silent benefactor too unimportant to even acknowledge properly. The girls giggled on cue, holding up their empty glasses for the cameras, playing their parts in this elaborate theater of deception. My mother-in-law, Elizabeth, sat frozen at the end of the table, her face pale as she stared at the menu prices she could see even from her position across the room. The color was draining from her face in real time, the realization of what her daughter was doing finally penetrating the willful blindness she had maintained for decades. Suddenly, she grabbed my elbow, her fingernails digging into my skin with desperate intensity as she pulled me up from my chair and dragged me into the shadowed hallway near the restrooms, away from the noise and the cameras and the spectacle her daughter was making of herself. Elizabeth's eyes were brimmed with frantic, terrified tears. She whispered my name like a prayer, her voice trembling with an emotion I had rarely seen from her. She told me that she knew Heather was completely out of line. She said she knew her daughter was wrong, but then she said the words that would crystallize everything I had been feeling for a decade. She asked me to be the bigger person. She told me to put the dinner on my card and let it go. She said we could not make a scene in front of these people. She said, please, just do it to protect the family. I stared at this woman who had been my mother-in-law for 10 years, this woman who had watched me sacrifice and accommodate and bend myself into pretzels trying to fit into a family that treated me like an ATM with a pulse. For a decade, she had demanded my silence to protect her daughter's fragile ego. She had expected me to swallow every insult, absorb every financial blow, and smile while doing it. I looked at her shaking hands, at the tears streaming down her face, and something inside me just clicked off. The generational guilt I had been carrying, the voice in my head that told me good daughters-in-law sacrificed for family, that women were supposed to keep the peace at all costs, that voice finally evaporated into nothing. When I spoke, my voice was dead calm, echoing off the tile walls of that narrow hallway. I told her that she always used the word family when she wanted me to swallow poison. I asked her if she wanted me to buy Heather a $3,500 dinner while my 10-year-old son got shoved out of his own birthday seat. Elizabeth opened her mouth to argue, her tears spilling over onto her cheeks, but I stepped closer, forcing her to look me in the eye. I told her that tonight, I would rather be a petty monster protecting my son than a bigger person feeding a parasite. I pulled my arm out of her grip, turned my back on her stunned expression, and walked straight toward the hostess stand to set events in motion that would change all of our lives forever. I locked eyes with the general manager, Marcus, a man I had worked with dozens of times over the years. In my line of work, Marcus and I were on a first-name basis. I routed tens of thousands of dollars in corporate dinners through his restaurant every quarter, bringing him high-value clients who tipped generously and never caused problems. He knew my face. He knew the power of my corporate account. He knew that when I called with a request, it was in his best interest to accommodate it promptly and discreetly. I pulled him into the quiet alcove near the kitchen, away from the chaos that was unfolding in the main dining room. There were no arguments, no messy family explanations, just pure cold logistics delivered with the professional detachment I had perfected over years of handling crises far more complex than this one. I told Marcus that the reservation for the private room was being moved. We would be taking our celebration downstairs to the chef's private wine cellar instead. It would be just my husband, my son, and our actual invited guests. I explained that table 4, where Heather and her friends were currently seated, was a walk-in as far as my account was concerned. Separate check entirely. I instructed him to add the mandatory 20% gratuity for large parties, but explicitly stated that he was not to authorize a single cent to my account. If they tried to put the bill on my tab, he was to decline it instantly. Marcus gave a sharp, professional nod. He had been in this industry long enough to understand exactly what was happening. He had seen family drama before, had witnessed the ugly underbelly of wealth and entitlement more times than he could count. He did not ask questions. He simply adjusted his approach to accommodate my instructions. I gathered Matthew, Noah, and our real friends from the lobby, guiding them down the spiral staircase that led to the lower level of the restaurant. We left the obnoxious noise of the main floor completely behind us, descending into what felt like an entirely different world. The chef's cellar was a sanctuary that smelled like aged oak and roasted garlic, the rich earthiness of fine wine stored properly for years. The lighting was soft and warm, casting gentle shadows across the stone walls lined with bottles that represented decades of careful collection. It was intimate and quiet, and exactly what Noah's birthday should have been from the beginning. The staff brought down Noah's cake with genuine ceremony, placing it at the center of a table that was finally sized appropriately for our actual party. They lit the candles with careful attention, and for the first time all night, my 10-year-old boy actually smiled. He looked around the room with wonder, taking in the curved brick ceiling and the neatly arranged wine racks and the attentive staff who treated him like the guest of honor he was supposed to be from the start. He finally looked like the king of the castle, and watching him, I felt the last traces of anger drain out of me, replaced by a profound sense of peace. I sat back in my leather chair and took a slow sip of my water, letting myself relax for the first time in hours. Downstairs, we had absolute sanctuary. Upstairs, the clock was ticking on Heather's gluttonous performance, and every oyster she swallowed, every glass of vintage champagne she clinked, every expensive morsel that disappeared into her mouth, and the mouths of her rented friends was just another nail in her own financial coffin. She was building her own gallows, and I was simply going to watch it happen. At exactly 9:15, the waiter placed a heavy black leather folder squarely in the center of table 4. The bill was $3,500, not including the gratuity that would bring the total to over $4,000. I had stepped out of the private cellar through a separate staircase and stood quietly behind the hostess stand, positioning myself where I could observe without being immediately visible. I wanted to watch. I had earned that much. Heather laughed when she saw the folder approach, a nervous, high-pitched sound that did not quite match the confident facade she had been projecting all evening. She aggressively snatched the folder from the waiter's hand, barely glancing at the itemized receipt before pulling a gold credit card from her wallet and tossing it onto the tray with the careless showmanship of someone who had never actually had to worry about money. The waiter slid the card into the point-of-sale terminal with practiced efficiency, and a sharp, high-pitched beep pierced through the ambient conversation of the dining room. Declined. The word hung in the air like a physical presence. Heather's manicured fingers twitched almost imperceptibly against the tablecloth. She let out a sharp breath, muttering something about a bank error that nobody believed for a moment, and dug frantically into her bag. She produced a second card with slightly more trembling hands than before, sliding it toward the waiter with an apologetic laugh that fooled no one. The waiter swiped it through the terminal. Beep. Declined. A visible sheen of sweat broke out along Heather's hairline. Her expensive foundation suddenly looked chalky and uneven, settling into the fine lines around her eyes and mouth that her Instagram filters usually erased. Her husband Kevin sat frozen in his chair, staring at his empty plate like it held the secrets of the universe, refusing to make eye contact with anyone at the table. Heather yanked a third card from the very back of her wallet, her hand visibly shaking as she shoved it toward the waiter with an aggression that bordered on assault. Beep. Declined. The sound was almost musical in its finality. Lexi, the lead influencer with the million-follower smirk and the designer clutch that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment, watched the third red light flash on the machine with an expression of dawning horror. She scoffed, a brutal, entirely unbothered sound that carried across the sudden silence of the table. Lexi reached into her clutch with a calm, deliberate motion and pulled out a single crumpled $20 bill. She tossed it onto the stained tablecloth with the casual contempt of someone discarding a used tissue. The words she spoke next would be immortalized on social media for weeks to come. She called Heather broke, pathetic, a fraud. She sneered with absolute disgust, her lip curling as she grabbed her coat and sprinted toward the exit, moving faster than anyone in 4-inch heels had any right to move. As she stormed past the hostess stand where I stood partially hidden, her thumb was already tapping furiously on her phone screen, blocking Heather on every social media platform before her ride even pulled up to the curb. The remaining 5 girls scattered like roaches, dodging a flashlight, muttering fake excuses about babysitters and early flights and urgent phone calls, practically tripping over each other in their desperation to escape the blast zone. Within 60 seconds, Heather and Kevin were completely alone at a table laden with the remnants of a meal neither of them could afford, holding a $3,500 debt that was rapidly morphing into something much more serious. Heather whipped her head around, scanning the room for someone, anyone who might rescue her from this nightmare. Her eyes locked on me standing by the hostess stand, and the panic in her chest exploded into rage. She screamed my name across the dining room, her voice cracking completely, shattering the upscale dining etiquette the restaurant had carefully cultivated. Every head in the establishment turned toward our table. The waitstaff froze in their positions. Even the diners at distant tables stopped their conversations to witness the unfolding drama. Heather's voice was raw and desperate as she demanded that I come over and fix this immediately. I walked up to the edge of her table with measured steps, taking my time, letting her stew in the silence that stretched between us. I looked down at the mountain of empty oyster shells glistening with residue, the drained bottles of vintage champagne standing like tombstones across the white tablecloth, the shattered remains of the evening she had tried to steal from my son. I looked at the terrifying reality sinking into her wide, desperate eyes, the dawning comprehension that she had finally run out of people willing to sacrifice themselves for her comfort. When I spoke, my voice was quiet but perfectly clear. I told her that uninvited guests pay their own way. I turned my back on her and walked out the heavy glass doors into the cool night air, leaving her to face the consequences of her choices without the safety net she had always taken for granted. Marcus did not let them follow me. He intercepted Heather before her shoes even hit the lobby tile, his imposing frame blocking her path with professional firmness. Heather tried to scream, tried to bluff her way through with threats and demands, and the kind of scene that usually made people back down just to make her stop. But Marcus was a professional who had dealt with far more dangerous people than a middle-aged influencer facing her first real consequence. He simply placed a collateral agreement on the host stand with the calm efficiency of someone who had done this many times before. He gave her an ultimatum that left no room for negotiation. She could sign the paper agreeing to return with payment within 24 hours, or she could leave in the back of a police cruiser for defrauding an innkeeper, a charge that carried real legal consequences in our state. Heather swallowed her pride, a foreign sensation that tasted like poison in her throat. She surrendered her iPhone 14, her driver's license, and Kevin's car keys directly into the restaurant's steel safe, items that would serve as collateral until she could produce the money she owed. Marcus gave her exactly 24 hours to return with $3,500 in cold hard cash. No exceptions, no extensions, no excuses. The story should have ended there at the restaurant, a sufficient punishment for a woman who had never faced consequences before. But desperation makes toxic people remarkably stupid. By 9 o'clock the next morning, Heather was driving toward my house clutching an old spare key she had kept from when she used to house it for us years ago. She was not just coming for Noah's birthday presents, which she probably assumed would be valuable enough to pawn for quick cash. Because of my event coordination business, she knew I kept a $5,000 emergency vendor envelope locked inside my home office desk, cash I maintained for situations where vendors required immediate payment in ways that electronic transfers could not accommodate. She was planning to rob my livelihood to save her own skin, to violate my home and steal from my business, because she had run out of legitimate options. But I knew exactly who I was dealing with. I had spent a decade watching Heather operate, learning her patterns, understanding that her sense of entitlement would eventually lead her to believe she had the right to take whatever she needed regardless of the consequences. The night before, after we had returned home from the restaurant and put Noah to bed with his faith in his birthday at least partially restored, I had called a locksmith. I had a technician rip out the old cylinder locks and install a digital keypad deadbolt with no physical keyhole. The kind of lock that cannot be picked because there is nothing to pick. The kind of lock that requires a code or remote authorization from my phone. I had also upgraded our security system to include motion-activated cameras with high-definition, recording capabilities and two-way audio that could be accessed remotely from anywhere in the world. My phone vibrated violently on the kitchen counter at 9:17 the next morning. The security camera feed flashed onto my screen, and I watched as Heather approached my back patio door with the determined stride of someone who believed she still had rights to everything I owned. She was frantically wedging a flathead screwdriver into the frame of the door, attempting to pry it open with the clumsy technique of someone who had clearly never had to break into anything before. The security system triggered immediately, and a 105-decibel siren ripped through the quiet suburban morning with enough force to wake neighbors 3 houses down. Any normal burglar would have sprinted for their car the moment that sound pierced the air. Any rational person would have realized they had been caught and fled before the consequences could catch up to them. But Heather was neither normal nor rational in that moment. She was a cornered animal, stripped of all her pretenses, operating on pure survival instinct and the narcissistic belief that rules did not apply to her. Instead of running, she froze, then turned to face the camera with an expression of absolute rage. I tapped the microphone icon on my screen and spoke through the porch speaker with a calm that surprised even me. I asked her if she was seriously trying to rob my business to pay for her oysters. That single question seemed to shatter whatever remaining sanity she had been clinging to. Her towering narcissism anchored her directly to the concrete patio, trapping her in place with the weight of her own entitlement. Instead of running like any sensible criminal, she stared straight into the camera lens and started screaming. She stood there on my patio, cursing my name, demanding I open the door, calling me every horrible thing she could think of, ignoring the blaring alarm that was surely alerting every neighbor within earshot. She was so consumed by her own fury, so convinced that she was the victim in all of this, that she burned through the exact 7 minutes it took for the patrol cars to arrive and block her in the driveway. I watched from the safety of my kitchen as the officers approached her with weapons drawn, ordering her to the ground with the kind of serious professionalism reserved for situations involving genuine threat. I watched them force her face down onto the pavement, the metal handcuffs clicking around her wrists with a sound that carried clearly through the morning air. I watched them read her rights and load her into the back of a cruiser, her screams of protest fading as the car pulled away from my house. The collateral damage from that morning was instantaneous and absolute. Kevin filed for divorce that same afternoon in a desperate attempt to salvage his workplace security clearance, which would have been compromised by any association with a felony charge. My in-laws, utterly terrified by the prospect of paying a criminal bail bondsman and potentially losing their own assets in the fallout, permanently blocked their golden child's phone number. The police cruisers drove away with Heather locked in the back, but the absolute destruction of her life had only just begun. Physical laws have a domino effect, and so does the legal system when you give it the right push. Because Heather spent that entire morning sitting in a county holding cell awaiting arraignment for attempted residential burglary, she physically missed her 24-hour deadline to pay the restaurant the money she owed. Marcus did exactly what he had promised to do. He handed her collateral over to the police as evidence and officially filed a second felony charge for theft of services. 2 felonies in 2 days, each one carrying potential prison time and definite financial consequences. The court eventually handed her a harsh plea deal that her overworked public defender recommended she accept. She received 3 years of strict probation with mandatory check-ins, 500 hours of community service that would have to be completed while maintaining some form of employment, and a court-ordered restitution of $3,500 to be paid directly to the restaurant. But the legal consequences were only the beginning of Heather's problems. The social fallout was even more brutal in its own way. Lexi and the rest of the fake influencer friends had not simply moved on after that disastrous dinner. They had found Heather's public mugshot on the county sheriff's website and posted it across their social media platforms with commentary that was as savage as it was effective. The posts went viral in their niche community, destroying whatever credibility Heather had managed to build with her influencer persona. Within days, her follower count was plummeting, as people realized that the glamorous woman they had been following was actually a broke, desperate fraud facing felony charges. Kevin finalized the divorce in under 6 months, prioritizing his corporate security clearance over any remaining loyalty to the woman who had nearly destroyed his professional life, along with her own. My in-laws had to empty their remaining retirement savings just to cover her defense attorney, watching the money they had spent decades accumulating disappear into the black hole of their daughter's consequences. The sheer financial terror of nearly losing everything finally broke their toxic loyalty to the golden child who had been bleeding them dry for years. They blocked her number for good, choosing their own survival over the daughter they had enabled into destruction. 6 months passed, and the dust slowly settled on the absolute transformation of our family dynamic. Then, one Tuesday, a plain white envelope arrived in my mailbox with no return address. Inside was a handwritten letter from Heather, scribbled on cheap notebook paper in the messy script of someone who was not accustomed to writing anything by hand anymore. She wrote about how hard her life was now, living in a cramped studio apartment on the wrong side of town, working a minimum wage job because her influencer career had evaporated overnight. She wrote that she forgave me for overreacting to what she called a simple misunderstanding. She actually used the phrase that at the end of the day, we were still family. I read the ink on the page, feeling absolutely nothing. My pulse stayed perfectly steady. My hands rested calmly on the kitchen island, without a tremor of anger or regret or the complicated emotions I might have felt a year earlier. I folded the paper in half, dropped it directly into the trash can, and went back to making my morning coffee. Our house feels entirely different now. The air is light, as if a weight I did not even realize I was carrying has been lifted. We hosted a summer barbecue last weekend, filling the backyard with our actual friends, neighbors who had become like family, and colleagues who respected my time and my home. Nobody demanded expensive wine they could not pay for. Nobody screamed at my son or shoved him out of his own chair. Noah ran around the grass with his friends, laughing until his sides hurt, secure in the knowledge that he was surrounded by people who valued him. We had built a circle of people who treated us with basic human decency, who contributed rather than drained, who celebrated with us rather than exploiting our generosity. We had chosen our family, and the peace was absolutely deafening in the most wonderful way. Toxic people build prisons out of their own fake images, and they demand you pay the rent to maintain them. But you always hold the key to walk out. You always have the power to close your wallet, set your boundaries, and let them face the consequences of their own choices. If you are exhausted from carrying the weight of someone else's entitlement, I need you to remember 3 essential rules that took me a decade to learn. First, blood never makes you family. Basic unwavering respect does. Never let biology be a free pass for emotional abuse or financial exploitation. Family is not the people who share your DNA. Family is the people who show up for you, who honor your boundaries, who treat you with the same consideration they demand for themselves. Second, boundaries without ironclad consequences are just suggestions. If you do not let toxic people face the natural results of their behavior, they will never stop leaning their dead weight entirely on you. They will take every inch you give and demand a mile, because that is what entitlement does. It consumes without gratitude and returns for more. Third, true power is silent. You never have to scream. You never have to argue. You never have to engage in the dramatic confrontations that toxic people thrive on. You just have to separate the checks, lock your doors, document their behavior, and let gravity do its job. That $3,500 I refused to pay is currently sitting in a high-yield college savings account for Noah, growing steadily, while Heather works to pay off her debts to society. I know exactly what you are thinking as you listen to this story. You are sitting there asking why on earth I bylaid this woman out for years. Why I let her steal $2,000 from our vacation fund without calling the cops the very first time. Why I tolerated a decade of disrespect and exploitation before finally reaching my breaking point. It is so easy to judge from the outside, to imagine that you would have handled things differently, that you would have set firm boundaries from the beginning and never let it get to this point. But let us get real for a moment. I was not stupid. I was not weak. I was not blind to what was happening. I was trapped in what behavioral psychologists call the slot machine effect, formerly known in academic literature as intermittent reinforcement. When you are dealing with a toxic family member or an entitled golden child like Heather, they do not treat you like garbage 100% of the time. If they did, walking away would be easy. Instead, every once in a while, they give you a crumb of hope, a fake apology that sounds sincere in the moment, A decent holiday dinner where they manage to behave themselves. A fleeting moment where they act like a real supportive family member who appreciates everything you do. Those rare positive moments hit your brain like a jackpot, flooding you with dopamine and hope that maybe this time things will be different. You keep putting your money and your emotional energy into the machine, pulling the lever, hopping for the payout of genuine love and respect that you desperately want. You are not weak. You are simply addicted to the illusion that they will eventually change. You are chasing the high of that rare positive interaction while ignoring the mountain of evidence that tells you who they really are. But when the illusion finally shatters, when you reach that breaking point where the cost of maintaining the fantasy becomes higher than the pain of letting it go, you have to pivot. And that is exactly what I did at that seafood lounge on my son's 10th birthday. Let me break down the masterclass in financial self-defense that unfolded that night, because there are lessons here that might help someone watching who is currently trapped in their own situation with a toxic family member or financial parasite. First, I used what I call the audit strategy. Scammers and entitled leeches absolutely thrive in the gray area. They love saying things like just put it on one tab and we will figure it out later, or do not worry about the exact numbers, or can we just handle this as a family? Those vague arrangements allow them to avoid accountability while quietly shifting costs onto you. I destroyed that gray area by intercepting the manager and forcing a separate check. When you demand an itemized bill, when you draw a hard logistical line on exactly who pays for what, parasites panic. They cannot survive under a magnifying glass. They need the shadows of ambiguity to hide their exploitation. Drag them into the light and watch them scramble. Second, I executed what I think of as building the case. When Heather showed up at my house the next morning intending to rob me, I did not just yell through a screen door or open myself up to a physical altercation. I did not give her the satisfaction of an emotional confrontation that she could later twist into a story about my instability. I let my high-definition security cameras do the heavy lifting. I stayed safely inside my home, used the two-way audio to keep her talking and engaged, and gathered undeniable time-stamped video evidence while the police were already on their way. In the real world, your frustration will not get you a conviction. Your word against theirs will not protect you in court, but hard digital evidence, clear documentation of their actions, that will hold up when it matters. Finally, I embraced what I call the buyout strategy. For years, my in-laws had begged me to just pay the bills to keep the peace, treating my financial sacrifice as the price of family harmony. But I realized that walking away and letting Heather face her own $3,500 disaster was the ultimate investment in my own freedom. Sometimes the absolute cheapest way to get a toxic person out of your life forever is to let them bankrupt themselves on their own tab. Let them experience the consequences of their own choices without your safety net to catch them. It will hurt them more than any confrontation ever could, and it will cost you nothing but the discipline to stay silent. Here is the final verdict after everything I have been through. Your bank account is not a rehabilitation center for someone else's bad choices. Your home is not an open resource for people who refuse to respect your boundaries. Your peace is not a reasonable sacrifice for maintaining relationships with people who drain you. Protecting your peace is not petty. It is basic survival. If you are funding someone else's fake reality, it is time to close the bank. If you are exhausting yourself to maintain someone else's illusion, it is time to step back and let reality do what reality does best. I want to hear from you. Have you ever had to use the audit strategy on a toxic family member? Have you ever had to separate the checks in your own life, literally or metaphorically? Drop your experiences in the comments below, because sharing your story might just give someone else the courage to draw their own line in the sand. If this breakdown gave you the clarity you needed today, hit that subscribe button. Stay smart, protect your peace. And remember that the most powerful thing you can ever do for yourself is to finally stop paying for other people's choices.